bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the July 21st, 2026 episode. As our audience on YouTube can see, my guest this week is Peter Lawrence. Peter is Novogradac's Chief Public Policy Officer and is based out of Washington, D.C. And he's back for another in our Washington Watch series. On today's podcast, Peter and I are going to discuss the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, which became law roughly 10 days ago. And there's a lot in the bill. We're going to talk about some of the key provisions with a very targeted focus, which I'll talk about in a moment. Those of you who have listened to the podcast before, or have attended one of our or other community development conferences, or have read the notes of the Novogradac blog, or a number of other resources, Peter is an ideal guest for today's topic. Peter and his team are at the intersection of community development tax policy and the practice of community development. They're much sought after in terms of getting their advice on the practical effects of community development tax policy on the practice of community development. Now, the focus of today's podcast, as I mentioned, is this housing bill that has been enacted. And we're particularly focused on what it means for developers of low-income housing tax credit financed housing. We're going to be very targeted. The bill is quite extensive. So we wanted to have a podcast that really narrowly said, this is what developers and those who invest in low-income tax credit development should know about the bill. That said, if you work in affordable housing and there are other aspects of the bill that are particularly important to you, please do share those with us, and we'll reference those in future podcasts. Peter's also going to share what this bill means for those who work with new markets tax credits. So once again, the focus is what low-income tax credit developers should know about the bill and how this bill could end up positively affecting new market tax credit developments. We have a lot to discuss today, so if you're ready, let's get started. Peter, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thank you, Mike.
This is your 27th appearance. That's second only to Tony your Pony. And
What day, baby? I'll catch him.
Well, since he's also a host, it's like saying you're third to me and Tony.
Yeah, I'm never going to catch up to you, Mike.
So I'm sure many in our audience are familiar with your work, but for those who aren't, please do provide a brief summary of the work you do here at Novogradac.
Well, thanks again. I always appreciate the opportunity to join you, Mike, on the podcast. I can't tell you how many times people come up to me at various conferences, both Novogradac and non, to say, hey, I heard you on Tax Credit Tuesday. So it's always a pleasure for that. We, of course, here in the Public Policy Department are always available for a variety of public policy related engagements. If you ever researched on the various practice areas that heavily involve policy, please reach out to us. We are constantly taking those type of engagements. I always look forward to talking to you about your challenge that you need a public policy solution for. I also, for feel duty bound, you mentioned a lot of the ways I've been involved here at Novogradac. But I do want to just also put in a plug for our various working groups, meet monthly. I give a public policy update for almost all of them. So that's one certain way you can stay plugged in on what's happening in DC by joining one of those areas, including our low-income housing tax credit working group, which has been very active in talking about progress of this legislation. Definitely encourage you to reach out to us about joining one of those working groups, and happy to work with you in that context as well.
Yeah, thank you for noting the working groups, and thank you for all the work that you do with those working groups. And I would encourage our audience as well to become a member of one or more of the working groups. As you know, Peter, and most of our audience does, these groups do meet monthly and discuss a variety of current issues. So it's a key way to stay abreast of breaking news and what thoughts we and those you work with and or your competitors are learning about these provisions. So now, as I said in the introduction, the 21st Century Road to Housing Act is a bill with many, many housing-related provisions. many more provisions that we can discuss in one podcast. Now, I will include the blog post that you wrote about the bill in the show notes. So for those who want a more expansive assessment of the bill, they can go to the blog post. And this is also the focus of my September Novogradac Journal of Tax Credits column as to what developers of loan-free tax credit housing should know about the bill. Now, the Journal of Tax Credits article is going to be a sequel to this podcast. Most of the time, the podcast is a sequel to my journal article, but the August article is already written, so it won't come out until September. I thought it was really important that we get this information out as quickly as possible, because I hear that a lot from LIHTC developers saying, okay, there's a lot of talk about this 21st Century Road to Housing Act. What does it mean to me as a developer? And then similarly for investors and others, they're also wondering, what does this bill mean for the loan-free tax credit development community? And obviously they're investing in these types of developments. But before we jump into those provisions, we've identified a top 10, if you will. Once again, I'd love our audience who, if there's an 11, 12 to 13 that you think is really critical, to email us with those comments. But I would like to get from you a brief explanation for our audience. For those who aren't that familiar with the bill, you could share some of the highlights and maybe even a lowlight or two of the enactment and legislative history that got us to where we are.
Yeah, happy to do that, Mike. And I think it is worth, given I'm here in DC and I'm really focused on the sort of policy scene here, this legislation is being celebrated as one of the most consequential pieces of housing authorization legislation in decades, being compared to the Cranston-Gonzalez National Affordable Housing Act, which created the home program and many other things. So it is remarkable. It's not very often that Congress considers a housing bill by itself. Usually we here in DC are always talking about legislative vehicles. We need a legislative vehicle for this because housing is usually viewed as too niche to get enough attention to be able to travel by itself. But this was the exception. This legislation really kicked off about a year ago in the Senate Banking Committee and went through this very twisty path, many different twists and turns in that road, if you excuse the pun. And then the ending also was a little bumpy and unusual, where I actually was, I feel like I should tell you this typical DC anecdote. I was actually in the Capitol on June 24th when everyone was getting ready for the signing ceremony. The dais was lit with the flags there in the statutory hall in the Capitol building. Everything was getting ready for the president to sign this bill in a big public signing ceremony. And then the Truth Social post hit and everything was canceled. And we went through this little bit of a weird purgatory where everyone was waiting. Will he sign the bill? Will he veto it? But given the constitutional provision that once the House prevents legislation, which they did, the final enrolled bill on June 29th, it became law roughly 10 days ago at midnight on Saturday, July 11th. And there is so much in this legislation that is going to be very impactful across a large range of housing issues, but we're going to focus mostly on the top impacts for local housing tax credit developers. But there's really a lot in this. What it also just really demonstrates, underscores, just like we saw last year, when the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, making opportunity zones permanent, new markets tax credit permanent, and that huge, largest expansion probably on record for the local housing tax credit. Housing has really gained a forefront that I've never seen in my entire 25 plus years here in DC, with all of the attention. Members of Congress are constantly hearing how housing is a huge problem across all communities, urban, rural, suburban, and that there needs to be solutions. And even with this enactment of this huge bill, we're still continuing to hear about it, still hearing about what else can we do. And so I think that's remarkable and worth celebrating.
So thank you for that. And there are many members of Congress to give a shout out for the bill. Maybe we can chat about that more later. But I did want to give a shout out to Chairman Tim Scott. Several years ago, he had his broad-based housing bill, and then to take the initiative to reach across the aisle and have a bipartisan bill in the Senate, and then moving on to working with the House to get a bill that was satisfactory to both. As you mentioned, it was a bit of a tortuous path, but definitely something that we owe thanks to a lot of legislators, none
It's
more.
huge margins on both sides. 90 votes in the Senate and over 300 in the House. It was quite remarkable, that level of support. Doesn't happen very often here these days.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So now let's talk about the key provisions that affect affordable housing developers, most particularly LIHTC developers. And I'll say one more time to our audience, please email us additional points that are particularly relevant to you as a developer and or as an investor. This is our top 10 list for LIHTC developers. I will say that some of these items we're going to discuss affect all LIHTC developments. All of these 10 affect at least some LIHTC developments. So it's something that our listeners and viewers should be very focused on. And real quickly, we'll go into each of these in detail. We have public welfare investment increase. We have edits and adjustments to the build to rent provisions that initially were pretty frightening. That's number 2. Number 3, the Build America, Buy America provision, the implications this bill has on those. 4th, implications on home funds. 5, the implications of the bill on the RAD cap, Rural Assistance Demonstration Program cap. 6th, the decoupling of USDA rental assistance. 7, increasing FHA loan limits. 8, adjustments it makes with respect to community development block grants for disaster recovery appropriations. 9, the NEPA streamlining, environmental review streamlining. And 10th, the provisions that will incentivize more housing in opportunity zones. I recognize I went through, there are some acronyms and all the rest. I don't expect everyone in our audience to understand all 10 of those. That's the purpose of us going through each one individually. So Peter, let's talk about the public welfare investment provision. Let's start there. That's the provision that I think has gotten the most focus among a large number of the long-term tax credit advocacy organizations. And if you could share with our audience what they should know about the impact of this provision. Start with a brief explanation of what it is, because when you say public welfare investment provision, if you haven't been following this pretty closely, you might be not quite aware what the significance of it is and what it means.
Sure thing, Mike. So the Public Welfare Investment Authority is what, under the National Bank Act, gives the authority for banks to make investments outside of loans. Typically, banks, their main thing to do are loans, right? Well, under the public welfare investment, banks are allowed to make investments that benefit the public welfare. And it's related. It's not the exact same thing as the community reinvestment, which many podcast listeners are no doubt are well aware of and how important that is as well. It's a slightly different banking regulation, but what basically it says is banks cannot invest, well, they couldn't in the past, prior to the 21st century, more than 15% of their bank capital on surplus. And that sort of served as a really upward limit in the amount that a bank could invest. Now, it's true that not every bank is at that 15% limit. And the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, the Affordable Housing Investors Council, and the National Association of Affordable Housing Lenders conducted a survey not too long ago to try to determine to what extent this cap is affecting banks and their public welfare investments. And they found that of the roughly 2/3 of banks that responded to the survey, 43% of them were hitting their 15% cap. And you can think about this as the big 4 banks, given their large denominators here, are probably not those ones that are hitting the 15%, but the tier below that are much more likely. And that sort of cap was limiting investor demand. We're at a time right now, and we just posted our second quarter low-income housing tax credit equity pricing as of when this podcast will be posted. And what we see in the data has been erosion in equity pricing. Obviously, the limited investment demand is contributing to that picture. And so having that cap increase to 20% is going to be very, very helpful in helping buttress investment demand. However, as I think you were right to point out, Mike, it's not instantaneous. We need to get the guidance out from the various federal bank regulators, in particular, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is the regulator for the big national commercial banks, which comprise the most of the low-income housing tax investors. But the Federal Reserve also has a role to play with certain banks and also states, because there are some state legislation that will need to be amended to update to this new standard. And to that point, I did actually meet with the Office of the Comptroller of Currency and their public welfare investment team recently and made the point we need that guidance out as quickly as possible. And I think it's not terribly complex to do this update. And so we don't anticipate it'll take a huge amount of time. We do need to see that before the banks will be able to go beyond that 15%. And I should just also point out, it's not something that state banks can just do automatically in any case, even once the guidance is out, right? Because you're allowed to go up to that level if it's deemed to be safe and sound. There's a process for that. That's going to be a key component of this. I don't anticipate that there to be a problem there and that this would trip a lot of banks, but still you have to go through the various steps in that process. And hopefully once that has been fully implemented, that will help produce some upward pressure. I'm not going to say it's going to be X number of cents because there's a lot of factors, as you know, Mike, as you always point out, there are a lot of things contributing at any one moment in time. Equity pricing, but it's a positive force there with that in concert with maybe other things, we can get the pricing back up on that point.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you pointing out that it does create upward pressure on pricing. Obviously, it's not immediate upward pressure because of the steps that have to be gone through, but certainly banks can now be planning on it and expecting to get it and such. And there's so many other factors because we definitely get a lot of the questions about how much is equity pricing going to go up because of this. And given all the various factors, it's hard to know what the sort of net effect it will have. But upward pressure is good. And some transactions in particular, we'll see it more than others because it's obviously impact most notably those transactions that are attractive for CRA motivated investors that are currently limited based upon the 15% limit. And this will allow them to go higher and invest more in such transactions. So let's turn next to what I want to call more like dodging a bullet. And this second provision deals with build to rent LIHTC developments. And actually, whether the me's going to explain it, if you could explain what was in the original Senate bill at a high level. And that's why I say dodging a bullet. This wasn't so much a provision that was part of the effort to expand housing. It was more of a different provision designed to limit certain types of investors. And that limitation of certain types of investors could have had an adverse effect on the LIHTC market and definitely did for a period of time. And I say loan to detached, but it also had an impact on opportunity zones, because a large number of opportunity zone developments were build to rent housing. And these build to rent housing provisions were freezing the market for opportunity zone development until it was resolved. So if you could explain the build to rent provision that was originally in the Senate bill roughly, and then where we ended up.
Sure. Happy to do so, Mike. And I guess for those who may not be as fully familiar with build to rent, if you could actually conceive of them, I like the sort of terminology that Sharon Wilson, the president of the National Multi-Housing Council, likes to use, and that it's really like a horizontal apartment building. Instead of having all the units go up in a high-rise building, it looks like your typical suburban subdivision of 15 to 20 homes in a particular area, but it's really financed, not that much different from a multifamily. It's one piece of land. The units are managed collectively with one asset management, one maintenance department, so to speak. And it's providing an option that, a lot of the households are increasingly wanting to demand. They, for a variety of reasons, don't want to buy a simple home with a mortgage because of their circumstances, but they still want to have a little bit more space than you typically can find in an apartment and have that style. And it's become increasingly popular. We've seen estimates these days in recent years that it's about 120,000 units that are financed through this process. And based on an early version of the bill that came by somewhat unexpectedly, we did know for a while that given the January executive order that President Trump said about trying to limit institutional involvement in homeownership, we knew there was a priority that that precedent had. I don't think there was any anticipation of a direct impact on build to rent. And in fact, actually that executive order back in January had language specifically exempting build to rent, which we thought was a recognition of that. But unfortunately, in that version of the provision before that fortunately has now changed, what it said is anyone who was an institutional investor, and this definition of institutional is one that I don't think anyone thinks
With
of
big
when
as
they think of an
institutional.
institutional investor. 950 homes. I mean, that's certainly not mom and pop, but it's not what most institutional investors are usually far higher than that. But for whatever reason, that number was the one number picked. If you had that, they were not allowed to own more than that 350 limit of single. And this is the way the definition of a home here for this purpose is 1 to 2 units. And if you found yourself in that circumstance, you were required within 7 years to dispose of that to a single owner, a non-institutional investor in essence. And while you can understand sort of the general 30,000 foot motivation of trying to get more homes available for home buyers and not being outcompeted by institutional equity, it really would have been extraordinarily damaging to the build-to-rent sector because it's not so easy. I mean, can you imagine, for instance, if you have a 350 unit apartment building trying to condoize 350 units into separate ones? That's essentially what the bill was saying. Within 7 years, you've got to go to your various zoning and land use entities to get them rezoned and land separated out. And then, by the way, you have to kick out all those folks. Families are one of those things, which ironically could have been a lower income than the people buying the homes. So I think the consequences of this version of the bill was not as well thought out. And there was quite a vigorous response from many housing organizations. And fortunately, that 7-year disposition requirement was removed. And by the way, that, as you pointed out, Mike, could have affected more housing credit properties than you normally think, because a lot of the local housing tax properties, say like in Native American reservations or in rural areas, or even some rural towns in New England, there are a lot more of those 1 to 2 unit properties that are financed than you would think in the build to rent style. And so I think we were all fortunate that both for the local housing tax credit developers that use this model or opportunity zones, that this is no longer there. Now, there is something there. There's a provision on institutional ownership, but there are these exemptions now that don't provide as much of an impediment to build to rent.
So thank you for that. This was a bit of a back to the future for me, in that some of the first local sector developments that I worked on were build to rent. I guess technically they were build to sell that converted to build to rent. So it was interesting to see the provision in. And I will just say to our audience, if there are any investors, there were investors on the sidelines when the bill first came out with respect to certain types of developments. So really the investors were on the sidelines with just certain types of developments investors weren't interested in. And even if technically they weren't going to be captured by the provision as originally proposed, investors didn't know how the provision was going to evolve. But now that we have a bill that's been enacted, we're not aware of any investors that are still on the sidelines with respect to certain types of deals. But if you're experiencing that, please do send us an email and just let us know that that's happening. So we want to, from a policy perspective, be focused on that and seeing what we can do to overcome whatever issues a particular investor has with that type of build to rent development. But definitely very good news to be where we're at. Let's turn to our third, and that's the Build America, Buy America provisions in this bill. If you could briefly explain the Build America, Buy America provisions and how this bill might affect that and ease the burden of what's commonly referred to as the BABA rule.
Yeah, we could do a whole podcast on BABA by itself, Mike, but I'll try to be very brief here. So the provision in the legislation itself that was enacted is relatively narrow. It essentially says to HUD, you've got to actually take a look at your waiver process and try to change it to cut the red tape and make it easier to be able to proceed. I just want to make sure that's clear. But I think there's a larger concern across the affordable housing industry on how Build America, Buy America is the compliance associated with that. And just to step back a little bit for those who may not be as familiar with that, I'm sure many are, but for those who haven't heard about this, the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the big infrastructure bill in the Biden administration, was really the source of this requirement. And somewhat surprisingly, Biden administration decided to apply this provision, which again was intended more for infrastructure projects, right? Where you can think of a $500 billion bridge. That makes sense. Obviously, you're going to put in that much federal investment. This bill was all about incentivizing. And if there are American components out there, you want to prioritize that federal funding going towards infrastructures that use American sourced and manufactured products. There's relatively few. I think the example often has been discussed is there's something around 50 to 75 components, mostly iron and steel and concrete, right? But when you think of affordable housing development, there are loads of products inside. I've heard 3,000 and more elements to it. And this idea that you're going to apply the same requirement to affordable housing was a bit of a surprise and really troubling, given that there's so many things that haven't been made in this country for decades. One example we like to reference, elevators are not made in this country anymore. And yet, Baba said you had to source it. And getting a waiver took a huge amount of time. A minimum of 6, but maybe even 12 and the longer months to get a waiver. And given the tight timelines that affordable housing developers are under, that was to think about. And to think that maybe you get a waiver on one project, but the next project in your pipeline that using the same elements, you had to apply once again for another waiver. So it's an insane process and it needs to be changed. And they're beyond this one sort of more limited provision. There are a variety of efforts that Affordable Housing Committee is engaging on this. Actually, just yesterday, a request for information from HUD closed to really try to catalog exactly what the availability is of domestically sourced products that are used in affordable housing development. And hopefully there's been a robust response to that to really educate HUD what the true situation is. And furthermore, we know that the House Financial Services Housing Subcommittee Chairman Mike Flood is championing efforts to further go beyond that limited provision of the bill to do more, and has introduced a bill with Representative Goodlander from New Hampshire to really tell HUD, stop requiring this until 60 days after you've done a study and really figured this out. And then after that, they would institute essentially a 90-day shot clock, where if HUD hasn't given you a decision on your waiver request within 90 days, it's deemed to automatically be accepted. That's a more realistic timeline, given the tight timelines we have on affordable housing developments. That's just still a bill yet. It's not an enacted law, that Flood Goodlander bill, but I think there's efforts to try to push that forward, and maybe there'll be an opportunity down the line to get that enacted along and to expand upon this sort of more limited provision in 21st Century Road to Housing.
So thank you for that great overview, Peter. And we will include in the show notes the request, as well as some of the response letters that are publicly available to that request by HUD.
We did a blog on the Flood Goodlander bill too, so perhaps that can be included in the show notes.
No, great idea. We'll include that as well. And I did just want to emphasize your point about this coming out of the infrastructure bill back in 2021, because throughout the whole process, I know you were working the halls and talking to different folks about infrastructure and trying to get some funding for housing. And the pushback was housing isn't infrastructure. Except when it comes to Baba. Which obviously is very frustrating, as you expressed very well. So let's turn to the fourth item on our top 10 list, and that's the legislation will affect home funds and how they're allocated and used. Please describe the potential changes to home funds.
Happy to do so. So, Mike, technically the Home Investments Partnership Program, which I mentioned was established by Cranston Gonzalez back in 1990, the actual authorization of that program officially expired in 1994. And it actually hadn't been reauthorized officially. Yes, it's provided funding from year after year afterwards, but it actually hadn't been officially reauthorized until the 21st century. It is now permanently reauthorized. And there's a lot of reforms to address long-standing concerns about the statute to make it work easier. And I think really one of the more key implications of this is not necessarily in all those rules, but more indicating how Congress has now said, yeah, we like this program, we want to reauthorize it. It's a good signal to make sure that it'll get funded. I mean, last year in the fiscal year 2026, the House zeroed it out. And I think the fact that Congress has gone ahead and done this is a real good sign that when they get back to the appropriation process, which is stalled at the moment, it's a different podcast, potentially. But that appropriations, now that I think the appropriators are now going to say, okay, Congress is opined here. They want this program to continue. And I think that gives it much firmer footing. But there's a lot of useful improvements in that bill that will help both rental and homeownership housing, by the way, and make it easier to use, reduce the costs of compliance. And I know some people say, hey, Peter, is there something on Davis-Bacon there? No, unfortunately. There was, long ago in this process, provisions on that. I think there's still efforts ongoing there, and it doesn't have to be legislative. There could be some regulatory changes potentially, and I think there will be still discussions on that front. We don't have time to go over all of them in detail, but I think it's just we wanted to point this out, that given how often home is used as gap financing for low-income housing tax credit properties, it's really helpful to have that reauthorization and program streamlining and improvement.
So number 5, let's jump to the increase in the RAD cap. If you could briefly explain what the RAD cap is and the significance of the increase.
Sure thing. RAD, Rental Assistance Demonstration. This is the initiative that's now been around for over a decade to help convert HUD programs to more in line with traditional affordable housing finance, particularly public housing, which has been often a sort of separate world and how it was financed, unlike most other affordable housing developments. Congress initially, when they created this rental assistance demonstration, they put a cap on the amount of public housing that could be converted under it. And that cap prior to the 21st century road housing was 455,000 units. HUD hadn't quite reached that, but when you look at both what was in the pipeline and what HUD had done reservations for, they were going to get close to hitting the cap. And the development is never entirely, the conversion process is never a straight line. There's lots of different steps in that process. You can't perfectly say, oh, by this date, they'll hit the cap. It's not that easy to predict, but there was a good chance that HUD would hit that cap over the course of the next fiscal year. And so having that increase up will give certainty. These things take a long time to plan and arrange. And HUD having that, so they know they can now go to 555 means that the pipeline will be able to proceed on a normal pace and help convert yet more to that more stable, more public housing, to that more stable Section 8 financing platform.
Thank you for that. And we have a lot of clients that are very happy to see the increase in the RAD cap, as we work with many clients that are either public housing agencies themselves or public housing authorities themselves, or they're developers that joint venture with public housing authorities in order to take housing that's within the public housing authority purview and financing through public housing. And through the RAD program, they're able to transfer the properties to a public-private partnership. And our partner, Rich Larson, works in that area quite extensively, along with a number of other partners on these conversions. So seeing the increase in the cap means a lot of the developments we've been working on, there's a little bit less concern that they'll end up not having availability. And that was causing some to think, should they be pursuing it because there may not be availability. So that was a great provision to see in there. And then tangentially to that, we can go to our 6th provision, and that's decoupling USDA assistance, which when I think about the decoupling of USDA rental assistance, I think of that as somewhat similar to how these RAD conversions work. Now that can be more of a tool for rural properties. Please explain.
Yeah, rural housing development is somewhat different from HUD, right? In that while you can think of having it's a project-based rental assistance contract that would be separate entirely from the FHA financing, in the DA world, the US, prior to the 21st century road housing, the authority to have USDA rental housing meant was only possible if you had a Section 515 loan associated with it. So it sounds crazy, Mike, but there are properties out there that had $1 worth of 515 loans that just simply to make sure they continue to have that rental assistance authority is a huge impediment. I mean, can you imagine having all these properties with a de minimis loan just simply to go ahead? I think it made preservation of this very important rural rental housing stock much more difficult than it needed to be. And so while the USDA has done a pilot program to do a little bit of this decoupling, allowing for the rental assistance to continue, having Congress say once and for all, yes, the rental assistance can continue even if there is no 515 loan is a huge boon to preserving this stock. It's not providing more resources. So I do want to point out that many of these properties will need recapitalization resources. And again, yet another podcast, the HOPE Act could be a real important way of providing those resources. But this decoupling is certainly going to help facilitate rural rental housing preservation. And for those of you who are involved as a housing credit developer, I think you can view that process a lot easier now given this decoupling.
There's definitely huge needs for renovation dollars for former farmer home 515 transactions. And hopefully this can really be a boon for renovating such properties. And to the extent our audience is interested, we could do a podcast focused on that. If you're interested, please just send an email. I'll give you the contact information for the email at the end. It'll also be in the show notes. But that's number 6. Let's jump to number 7. And that's increasing FHA loan limits. So Peter, if I'm a low-state tax credit developer, why do I care about increasing FHA loan limits?
Well, they were in statute. And so given that, and I think many in the multifamily industry thought these FHA loan limits are really too low given the current market realities. So they were overdue and unfortunately they now are giving HUD the ability to increase them much more in line and more timely with the market development. TIF financing can be very enticing for housing credit developers who got a 40-year amortization. I know it doesn't always work for everybody, but it can be very helpful. It's very often used, for example, back to talk about the RAD conversions. Having those increase in loan limits will certainly make it a lot easier to use multifamily mortgage financing.
Right. Thank you for that. Now, number 8, let's turn to community development block grant disaster recovery funding. And this is lower in our top 10 list because it's going to affect those areas that suffer a natural disaster. And then there's community development block grant funding available. And these provisions are designed to get that money to those areas much faster. Please explain.
Right. So, when a major disaster hits, people first think about FEMA. And obviously FEMA is very focused in the immediate aftermath. But the long-standing recovery is often financed with appropriations from Congress through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Programs. And unfortunately, Congress never had a common set of rules. You have a common set of rules for CDBG in general, or a common set of rules for home in general that we just actually revised in this bill, but there was no regular rule associated. So Congress literally and HUD has to recreate each time there's a disaster and they decide to appropriate money. So you can imagine trying to have to recreate a program every time a disaster. It really slows the process down. And I think while some people will say, well, you can design it for what you need, most people would say it's more important to make sure that the funding comes in a timely manner. And so what the 21st Century Road to Housing is it calls on HUD, create this program that folks can use as program rules to get the money out faster to create. Since it was given a 3-year authorization, so Congress is going to have to come back and review those rules and authorize them. But getting HUD to create that common set of rules is going to be very helpful, especially for a lot of places that have been waiting to get that CDBGD funding to help in their recovery.
Preparing for the podcast, did you mention Hawaii as one of those areas?
Hawaii is one of those areas. Congress did give a big amount of FDR funding for the Maui fires, but they're still waiting to get those rules and to get the funding, given the fact that God had to create anew. And this will hopefully help those developers working in Hawaii to access that funding in a timely fashion.
So number 9, and I know you and I talked about where 9 should be in the ordering here, but that has to do with NEPA streamlining, basically a streamlining of environmental review rules. We're not NEPA experts, but at a high level, if you just mention this to our audience.
Yeah, so NEPA stands for the National Environmentally Policy Act. And basically, it's the cross-cutting law that affects how HUD financing is used for both new construction, but also for preservation. And one of the maddening things about NEPA prior to this legislation is that it didn't really adequately consider the differences there. You can understand if you're building, say, a new housing development in an environmentally sensitive area, then yes, you have a full environmental reviewing to make sure that you're addressing that. But it was applied, I think, in many, many ways that didn't really make sense. For instance, if it was a preservation building that was still there, you still had to go through an environmental review as if it was new construction. Or say you started with an FHA loan and then you decided to add home to it. You had to do a second environmental review. There's all these various things that made no sense. And this legislation helps rationalize and streamline this to more appropriately tailor what their environmental review is based on what you're doing.
So thank you for that. Now we'll get to our 10th one. And this is the one where those who are involved in opportunity zones are going to say, we saved the best for last. And that's, how does this bill incentivize the development of housing and opportunity zones?
This is obviously was a big priority for the Senate Banking Committee Chairman Tim Scott, such the leader on opportunity zones. What this provision would do is to tell HUD, okay, when you're having a competitive grant program, you need to have priority for housing that is placed in opportunity zones. Part of the premise behind opportunity zones is that it's leveraging a lot of different sources of funding to concentrate on particular geographies to really help the revitalization and economic and community developments in those long-term census tracts. So, the opportunity zone and tax incentive is one thing, but it's intended to bring other things together with it. And this would say, if you've got a competitive grant program tied, one component of that has to be, are you planning to develop housing in an opportunity zone? So that, I think, will help bring and build yet more housing. We know opportunity zones are financed a lot of housing as it is under 1.0, but yes, this will help, I think, get even more under OZ 2.0.
Yeah, I'll emphasize that opportunity zones have been amazing in the amount of rental housing that's been built in opportunity zones, the 1.0 round. And for those of you interested in learning more about it, please do reach out to my partner, Jason Watkins, who does head up the Opportunity Zones Working Group. And I will also note that many of the audience that are experienced with LIHTC know that the ability to use opportunity zones to incentivize investors in long-term tax credit properties is somewhat limited for a variety of reasons. That said, we've been saying for well over a year that if you're looking at developing housing in opportunity zones, even if you're looking at developing long-term tax credit housing in opportunity zones, you should be involved in the nomination process, which is underway by the various states. They have 90 days starting on July 1 to nominate the select number of zones as opportunity zones that Treasury then has to designate. That even if you don't think you can use the opportunity zones capital gain benefit, you likely over time will find that those areas have other incentives tied to being an opportunity zone was worthy of getting such a designation if it makes sense for a particular state. And this was like classic ratification of that advice.
Surprising number of HUD-assisted properties in opportunity zones. We saw that in 1.0. There still are under 2.0. And so you want to make sure that while a zone might be eligible, you still got to make sure that your governor picks it. You definitely want to make sure if you haven't already engaged, you need to engage right away in that process so you can take advantage of that.
So let's turn now to new market tax credits. The podcast is principally about the long delay tax credit and what developers need to know. We went through a top 10 list, but we also have a large number of clients that work with new market tax credit financing. What does this bill mean for new market tax credit financing?
So that PWI increase that we mentioned at the top, there are number one, that should also help with new markets investment ban, because new markets tax credits, like the low income housing tax credits, are key public welfare investments. And so banks that are still at that 15% limit were also limited in their ability to invest in new markets credits. And that limit has been removed for those banks. And so they should be more free to invest in new markets than they were previously. And while there hasn't been as much of a focus on equity pricing for a variety of reasons for new markets, certainly the more investors you have that are interested will make it more likely that your deal gets done. So it's going to be helpful there. The other aspect is, I mentioned a little bit in the course of discussing these provisions, for instance, like in the home program, there are a lot of resources that are changed to help incentivize homeownership as well, in addition to rental. And we know we're all eagerly awaiting the announcement of the 2026 round, which is intimate in Treasury speak, which I know is not intimate necessarily or what many other people think of as intimate, but it's coming soon. And we are widely expecting that this round will put further emphasis on using new markets for homeownership. We all saw in March that there was an executive order calling on Treasury to look at the new markets tax credit and opportunity zones to try to promote the use of those incentives for homeownership. And I think we're going to see that effectuated in the 2026 round opening. And so the 21st Century Road should help with that pivot. We wanted to make sure folks were also aware of that as part of the context of this legislation.
And I'd also add, not only in addition to the next round, those of you that are members of the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, led by my partner, Brad Elphick, know that there has been additional guidance issued that allows prior allocatees to more readily use their prior allocation for single-family home development. So it's definitely something that is out there in a major focus, the City Buy Fund and more broadly, this administration. So Peter, thank you for that. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, there's so much more we could talk about with respect to this bill, and I encourage our audience to turn to our website for additional resources, and we'll include in the show notes links to a variety of these resources. I do also encourage our audience to look for my coming Journal of Tax Credits column that'll be out the 1st of September. That is a listing of these top 10. I'll also talk about the new market tax credit pieces. Also, as I've said many times, if there are additional parts of the bill that are really relevant to you as a local tax credit developer or investor, please share those with us as well. And maybe we'll even have some bonus items in that Journal of Tax Credits that we weren't able to cover here on the podcast, are particularly relevant to many in our audience. With that, please share some additional resources, Peter, beyond the show notes that our audience can turn to.
Well, I feel duty bound to mention that we do have 2 housing conferences coming up, one in Honolulu, Hawaii in September. And then we also have our housing tax credits and bonds conference in Nashville in early October. We're going to talk, I'm sure, no doubt, about the 21st Century Road to Housing. For those conferences. And I think we'll all be still in the context of pushing for the implementation of the legislation and how it's affecting housing development. So if you want to learn more, please come. I think both conferences are on our website. You can register for them. And I know roadblocks run out, et cetera, and so forth in the coming weeks. So encourage you to do that right away. I also just want to reiterate once again, at the top, I talked about our working groups and see another resource that you can access to stay in touch with developments, to stay in touch with the implementation of the 21st Century Road to Housing.
And I also encourage the audience to register for the conferences early. One, as Peter mentioned, Hawaii, then followed by Nashville. Register early, get your hotel rooms early, because they often do sell out, and then we end up getting calls and emails saying, do you have other options for us? And it's obviously a good problem to have, and we try to assist as best we can. But if you register early, you'll avoid being part of that group. So thank you, Peter. I really appreciate you being on the podcast. The email contact for those who do have provisions they want to share with us, contact@novoco.com is it. Contact@novoco.com. Please send any ideas you have in terms of additional provisions in the road to housing that is particularly relevant to you as a LIHTC developer. Also, if there's any additional topics you want us to cover in future podcasts and the like, please share those thoughts as well. And I do encourage you to share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. It's a great way for us to expand our audience, and it's very rewarding for me and my guests to hear from our audience and know that our listenership is rising. If you do see Peter or me at one of these conferences, please do come up and say hello. And with that, I want to turn to our off mic section, where we use this space to give a shout out to others working in the tax credit and tax incentive communities. The opportunity to highlight a professional or professionals worthy of recognition. Peter, who would you like to shout out?
So, Mike, given that we have been spending the podcast talking about the 21st century road to housing, it always feels appropriate to give a shout out to the legislative leaders behind it. And starting with Senate Banking Committee Chairman Tim Scott of South Carolina, as you mentioned before, his ranking member, Elizabeth Warren. They were instrumental on the Senate side. On the House side, House Financial Services Committee Chairman French Hill from Arkansas and ranking member Maxine Waters from California were crucial leaders of the committees on this. And then I also feel, given their extra involvement, really need to highlight the House Financial Services Subcommittee, Housing Subcommittee Chair, Mike Flood from Nebraska, and Emmanuel Cleaver from Missouri. They were all really influential in shaping the legislation, pushing it forward, being tireless champions, and we need to really sing their praises in getting this across the finish line and enacted into law.
Thank you for that, Peter. And I echo the shout out. It's quite amazing what those six, along with other members of the House and the Senate, were able to get accomplished in an era where there's so much concern about partisanship. To see such a high level of bipartisanship and coming together on something that is so substantial is quite encouraging as an American citizen. Oftentimes there's bipartisanship on things that aren't nearly as significant as this, and to see this level of bipartisanship on a significant issue like this is quite comforting. So thank you for being on the podcast today, Peter.
Always appreciate it.
And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.